let's get started. So once again, thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday afternoon for today's virtual presentation, A Disappearing Country, Algonkian Life in the 18th Century Northeast. My name is Victoria Waldron. I am the museum educator at the Albany Institute of History and Arts, and I am joined today by my colleague, Patrick Stensorn, the Director of Interpretive Programs, who will be assisting with any technical issues. He is logged in under the official Albany Institute of History and Art Education account, and if you're having any issues with your Zoom, please message him there. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Drew Shaptar-Ravis. Pekatawas Makataweu. Thank you so much. He graciously helped me with my pronunciation of that. He holds a cum laude Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and Sociology from Western Connecticut State University and a certificate degree in Archaeology from Norwalk Community College. A true American of the Mid-Atlantic region, his family includes Indigenous Accomac and Pocomoke heritage, Pennsylvania Dutch, Welsh, Swiss, English, Scots-Irish, Boyko-Ukrainian, and Ashkenazi Jewish. He honors all of his ancestors as a practicing living historian and regularly participates in colonial era reenactments, interpretations, and public educational events. He has studied and become proficient in the reading of Wampum, and works diligently in the research and preservation of the Eastern woodland languages, particularly Lenape and Mohican, and is educated in the many European languages at use in the colonial period. He was the first garden manager of Western Connecticut State University's permaculture garden and practices native horticulture. Please join me in welcoming Drew.
Nina Komawusak Nian Tanawis Pekatawas Maktawayu. Kiamanima Kianawanamao. So the phrase I gave is in Mohican, which is the language spoken in Albany. So I said, my name is Pekatawas Maktawayu, Black Corn. Kiamani Mahi Anawanamao. You give me great honor. So I said, hello, my friends. My name is Black Corn. You give me great honor. So this time I want to thank Albany Institute for Art and History for this program. Thank you for funding this program and saying, what, this part of our history is really important and we want to fund it. So thank you so much for this time. This is the disappearing country. So this is northeastern history from Algonkian history from 1700 to 1763. If you have any questions, anything I'm wearing, anything I have on this blanket, which I'll be able to move my camera so you can see. Also, thank you so much for understanding the limitations of Zoom. I will do my best to move my camera so that we can see everything I have on my blanket and furs that I have here. But if there's any questions of anything I'm wearing, anything I have, please feel free to ask questions and take a look. So we'll start from the top of this blanket from left to right. And if there's questions, feel free to ask. So I'll start with what I'm wearing. So 1700 to 1763, we're talking the early 18th century. And by this time, Algonkian and Iroquoian people are heavily involved in trade with Europeans. And by this time, much of the clothing that Native people were wearing were European admixtured clothes. So we'll start with my clothes. So my moccasins, it's probably one of the only things I have that are made of leather. I only have 3 things, 1, 2, 3, 4 things made of leather on my 5 things made of leather on my person right now. Everything else is European trade material. So my moccasins. So I have a better example. These are summer type moccasins. They're known as pucker center seams. So the toe is puckered and there's a center seam that runs up the middle. Eastern moccasins are made from one solid piece of leather. Sometimes they have these cuffs. Some of the cuffs, like on these ones are sewn. Some of them are not sewn. But moccasins were typically worn only when you were traveling. Only when you were in places that you weren't familiar with, because around your village, around the places that you lived, you didn't really wear shoes. There was no need to wear shoes because you knew that landscape really well. It was only when you went traveling, when you went hunting, when you went fishing, you might wear moccasins because you might not know the ground where you're at. And parts of New York State, since we're talking about the Albany Institute of Art History, you guys have a lot of flint and chert that'll slice your foot open. So moccasins are really, really important. So my moccasins are decorated. They have trade beads. These are called 50 seed beads. These are one of the most common beads of the 1600s and 1700s. We can document these type of beads all the way through to the late 1600s. And so these moccasins are decorated. Some of them were very decorated. Mine are moderately decorated. Moccasins protect your feet. We know through some paintings, moccasin times the tops were flipped up. Sometimes they're just left down. It really depends. But typically you would carry, like if you were traveling, hunting, fishing, you would carry extra moccasins with you. If you were on a war party, you would carry extra moccasins with you. You would put them in your belt, you would put them in your pack, because your moccasins might wear out while you were away. In the wintertime, you had different type of moccasins. You had, these ones are a boot moccasin. This one you can kind of see, it kind of goes up to your ankle. And it's insulated with wool inserts, moccasin inserts, and with furs. This one also has those 50 beads. And these are loosely based off of a pair from the 1600s. But boot moccasins like these were worn in the wintertime and in the fall, keeps your feet nice and warm. As we move more, so my leggings, since we're talking about clothes. So my leggings and my breechcloth, as you can see, are made from a material called stroud. Stroud is a type of wool cloth brought in by the English and the French. Both of them traded this type of cloth. We know stroud comes in like the end of the 1600s, but it's very, very prominent in the 18th century. Stroud, the native people really liked stroud in wool cloth because leather was hard to make. It takes time to make a deer skin into leather. You know, it takes about a week from skinning the animal, cleaning the hair, and stretching out the skin to turn it into leather. It takes quite a long time. So when European traders came, they brought with them wool cloth, and that wool cloth was way easier to make clothes. You could literally just fold it over your legs and cut it to shape and sew it right then and there. So my breechcloth is made from stroud. So the lines in the stroud are called a list. And how the list is made is when the cloth is being made in England or in France, it would be stretched out on a big wooden rack, and the list is formed where the piece of wood was holding the cloth in place. And the native people really liked the list. Europeans would cut the list off, but the native people really liked the list. They liked the pattern on it. And there's a lot of references and there's a lot of paintings of native people with their breechcloths and leggings with the list on them. And you can see the list on the tops of their leggings. You can see the list on their breechcloths. We look at my leggings. My leggings come up to my knee. They are made also of that stroud. And they have silk ribbon. We know by the 18th century, native people really like silk ribbon, and they're trading from the French and the English for gold silk ribbon, blue silk ribbon, and they're decorating their leggings, they're decorating their breechcloths with silk ribbon. And it's more for style, and it's, they like how it looks and they like the color of it. So if we move farther up to my shirt is a typical style 17th, 18th century shirt. These would have been made in Europe. They would have been made in England. They would have been made in France. They would have been made all different parts of Europe. And these shirts were really liked by the Indians. We know from the 17th and 18th century, even the early 17th century, native people are asking for shirts and they're asking for wool cloth. It's one of the things they really, really want, because before shirts, you just wore a skin mantle. So you wore, a deer skin, such as this guy, and this was your shirt. And so native people, when they were introduced to European shirts, wanted them. And we know they're one of the earliest and first trade items that native people ask and request for. And so my shirt, it's known as a long shirt. It's actually what Europeans would call an undershirt. This would be a shirt that you would wear to cover your nice clothes while you were working. But native people would wear these shirts, and they would wear them literally till they fell apart, till they were just literally rotting off their body. Same with the leggings. We know that leggings were made very tight to the skin. So Eastern leggings are very, very tight. They're very form-fitting. And we know native people would wear these till literally they rotted off their bodies. And that's recorded time and time again. So on my belt is made, this is a sash that's made from wool. See if you can kind of see it a little better. It's a wool sash. We know native people they've been native people, we've been finger weaving, we finger weave our own sash. We were doing this long before Europeans, but we were also trading for European stuff too. And so this is more of a European style sash, but it's one that, native people would have traded for, and they would have acquired through European traders or through battlefield. They would have just picked stuff off the battlefield, men would, in times of combat, and they would have taken things that they liked. And so on my belt, I have a couple things. I have my Apokan Parasap. I have my pipe bag, which carries my tobacco pipe and carries my tobacco bag. Every man would have carried a tobacco bag on them. Tobacco is very important to Eastern Woodland Native people. The Apawaka, which in my language means tobacco, was given to us by Kashmantu, the creator, and it was one of those things that was given to us because one of the old stories talks about at one time, all the human beings of the world were able to talk to all things. And what happened was human beings got very greedy, they got very selfish, and they lost this ability to speak to all the things of the world, the plants, the trees, the animals, the rocks. And so the human beings on Turtle Island here in North America were very, very sad. They couldn't talk to their ancestors who had died. And so Creator felt bad for us, and Creator said, well, I will give you this plant. This plant is called Upwalk, and if you treat this plant with respect and you treat it with love, you can talk to your ancestors again. You can talk to all things again. And so I have my Apokan here, my pipe, which is a soapstone style pipe. This is a very common Eastern Woodland style pipe, so you can see it a little better. It's known as a keel pipe. It's carved from soapstone. This was a very common pipe. We also know Native people are trading for European clay pipes by this time as well. But the pipe bag and the pipe was very important. This is how agreements, this is how treaties were signed. This is how agreements were made. Men would smoke not only just to relax but also to pray together and pray as a community and to give thanks for the day. We're always giving thanks for everything around us all the time. There's no set time. You do this every day. And so the pipe was very important. The Apokan is very important. So you would carry one either on your belt or you would carry a neck bag that would be on you as well. So I also have my Yokeg bag right here. This is also made of leather, and it's painted. So some bags were painted. We know in the 17th century, there's a lot more painted stuff. We know in the 18th century, there's some painted stuff too. That's kind of, it's 50-50. So by the 18th century, a lot more things are decorated with beads, such as this bag is decorated with beads and with cones. This one's just painted. But the Yokeg bag, Yokeg is parched cornmeal. So it's known as the traveler's food, the warrior's food. And parched cornmeal, so you would take flint corn, cook it up in a pan. Who's ever had corn nuts? How many people have had corn nuts before? Not many people. So corn nuts are delicious, but corn nuts are, since it's parched corn, it's fried parched corn. So you take the flint corn and you heat it in a pan and it puffs up and you grind it into a meal. And what it does, and I've been poor enough in my life to figure this out, that if you swallow cornmeal, what it does, it expands in your stomach and it gives your body the illusion you're full. So what warriors would do and men who were hunting would do, they would take handfuls of this parched corn, this Yokeg, and they would eat it so they didn't have to go hunting or fishing and start fires, especially in times of combat, because you can track people by their fires and where their camps are. So you could just swallow handfuls of cornmeal and keep walking and keep moving. And so you wouldn't have to light a fire and you wouldn't have to spend time hunting or fishing in order to feed yourself. So we know warriors, and it's well recorded that warriors would carry bags of Yokeg. This actually has Brits in there, ground hominy that's in there, which is another one. You start a fire, and this is enough in there to feed 4 people. But Yokeg would be carried in there too. And warriors would carry this on their belt, and this is the traveler's food. I have also this other bag. This has a painted design on it too. This is a slit pouch. So slit pouch is one long kind of oval piece of leather, folds over the belt. Slit pouches were used for a bunch of things. They were used for shot and powder a lot of times, where you would just put your hand in here, pull out your bullet, go into the other side, pull out, gunpowder, and load your gun that way. We know all the way into the 1690s that shot pouches are being used in that fashion. My slit pouch is used for holding all my fire making material. It's used for holding extra gun flints. as well as extra materials that I would need while I'm trekking, while I'm out in the forest. So if we're moving up from my moccasins, from my leggings to my shirt, what's on my belt, moving up, I have my neck knife, so we can see it better. So this neck knife is ornated with quill work. So that's porcupine quills that are soaked in water and are dyed and are then sewn, they are folded and sewn. This is an art form that goes back far before Europeans. This goes back to before contact. But we were doing quill work in the Northeast for thousands of years. And quilled knife sheaths were really, really common even before Europeans. We had bone and stone knives that had quilled knife sheaths. But quill work was a way we could ornate things and beautify the things we have. This is also decorated with brass cones and dyed red deer hair. As you can see, inside is a trade knife. This is a French-style trade knife. It's known as a bûcheron, which means in French a butcher knife. And this is a copy of one that was found at Fort Ticonderoga. But this is a very common style French trade knife of the 18th century. And Native people loved knives, axes, firearms. This made life 100 times easier, made things a whole lot easier, especially while you're cutting wood, you're cutting meat. This makes things a whole lot easier. And so neck knives are very, very common. And the English were making them, the French were making them. There were many different kinds. So if we go into my beads, I have a couple necklaces on. So I have some blue trade beads. There were many different kinds of trade beads. These ones are blue. There were many different kinds. These are solid blue beads. Beads were really important to Native people because before Europeans, there were, there was only shell, bone, stone, and copper, and that's it. So when Europeans come, they bring with them these glass beads, and glass was something that no one had ever seen before, and things that shine and make noise were seen as things that would scare away bad spirits, and so they were highly desired. And they're also beautiful. So Native people would trade for beads quite a lot. We know by the 18th century that there's a lot of also glass wampum that's being replicated in glass. And Native people really like this. This is known as the poor man's wampum, because it was, it wasn't as desirable as the real shell wampum, which I have some right here, which was still around by the 18th century. But glass wampum was one of those things that was very common. People by the 18th century, they was being used just as much as shell wampum. They were just as common. And I also have the real shell wampum here, which was the most desirable. It goes before European contact. We know shell wampum like this was used for everything, for belts, for making agreements, for making all sorts of things. Shell wampum was really, really important and was used for, signifying agreements, for making pacts, making strands that told you who you were, for condolences, for births, for deaths. It was used for everything. And I also have on my neck a shell gorget that ornaments my neck. This is made from eastern pearl shell mussel. There were many different kinds of shell gorgets. This one's just a pearl shell mussel. There were some that were made from whelk shells. There were some that were made from other kind of ocean shells. This one just happens to be pearl shell mussel. So moving up, my face is painted. So it's one of the things you would notice with non-Christian Native people was that they would be painted and tattooed, which was really common. It scared the crap out of the English because they weren't used to seeing painted and tattooed people. And painting was really, really common. Red signifies life, health, vitality. Red is a social color. It's a color that says I'm not going to hurt you, but it's here. I'm to peacock a little bit. Look how strong, look how virile I am. And red was a really, really common color. We know this all the way into the 1640s that Native people were painting themselves in red ochre, red hematite. And on the top of my head is my roach. My roach is made of dyed red deer hair. This is another one that ornaments the head of the man. Men tended to peacock more than women. So men were known for these red roaches even all the way through into the 1640s. We know from actually Adrian Vanderdonk, who lived in Rensselaerswyck, and he actually writes about how the Native people have the men have these red roaches in their hair. And it's the peacock. It's also the same thing. It's to show, look at me, look how strong, how fierce I am. It also, there's two meanings for this. So one, you have to remember for Eastern Woodland people, we are animists. So what's an animist? So an animist doesn't mean belief in animals. It believes that all things are animate, all things are living, all things are alive. And so in animism, you live in a world of good spirits and bad spirits. So good spirits want to help you. They want to make your women fertile. They want to make your land fertile. They want to make your hunting good. They want to help you and they want to do things for you. Bad spirits want to make you sick. They want to hurt you. They want to make your land and your women infertile. They want to do bad things to you. So part of the reason for this roach is that when you're born, the plates in your head fuse right into the spot. And so there's a tiny hole that's there where the plates in your skull fuse. And so this roach, red is a color, it's a sacred color, said to scare away the bad spirits. It protects that hole in the back of your head so the bad spirits won't enter your head. The other reason for it is that it's supposed to emulate the red-headed pileated woodpecker. So the red-headed pileated woodpecker is the warrior bird. So it's called that is the tapping of the war drum. And so the men wanted to emulate the woodpecker, and so they would put a crown of red over their head too. And that was the other reason for it. And my ears are pierced. You can see my sweaty face, but my ears are pierced. So these are ball and cone earrings. Another common trade item that Native people really liked were European earrings. And European traders would make these ball and cone earrings, and Native people really, really liked them. By the 18th century, they are everywhere. They are in every archaeological site that we look at and that we can find are these ball and cone earrings. And there's many different kinds. The kind that I have on were some of the most common, but there were many, many different kinds. So if we look at my blanket, try to move this camera a little bit down. You can see. So I'll start, since we kind of talked about the moccasins here, I'll move farther this way. So one of the things that men with, on this blanket, there's really only one object of war, and it's this guy. So this is known as a ball club. In Abenaki, it's known as galum. We know from Benjamin Church that the Wampanoags called this tomahawk, and we know the French called them cassetet, which means head breaker. So how this guy works, so it's made from one solid piece of wood. This is made from the burl of a tree. So a burl is essentially when the tree gets damaged, it forms a big scab of wood to protect where it got injured. And so burls tend to be really round and knobby. So this is a burl, and this is the branch of wood that it came off of. And this is ornamented with eyes made of eastern pearl shell mussel to look like a bird. And it's also wood burned as well. But clubs like this were carried by Eastern Woodland men even before contact. We know that they were carrying these clubs. And how do they work? Well, if someone's trying to hurt you or your family, all you have to do is, and they don't do that much anymore. This puts a fist-sized hole in somebody's face or breaks their bones to the point they can't walk. Some of these clubs have blades or knife blades or points, iron spikes put into them to do even more damage. The back of this is made into kind of a peak. See if you can kind of see that a little bit. And the reason for that, the oral history that was passed to me, is that it's meant to break collarbones. It's meant to break bones. So not only hitting this way, you hit with the back, and it's meant to shatter bone, is what the reason for why this is peaked in the back. But some of these clubs are very, very ornate. A lot of times these clubs would have the war record of that warrior, so they would tell you how many captives they took, how many people they killed. We know from one account in Western Pennsylvania, there's a guy who talks about how when he was taken by the Indians, the guy was drawing on his club the human figure that was his figure on the club and painting it red, meaning that he was being taken captive. This club was lost for over 100 years, and it was later found in Western Pennsylvania or Ohio in an antiques dealership. They thought it was a chair leg, and it's actually at Fort Pitt Museum now, and you actually can see the human figures that are still on the club. You can still look at them today, and it's the club from this man's narrative. So one of the other things we have on this blanket are axes. So when Europeans arrive in the 17th century, one of the first things that they trade with Native people, besides knives, are axes. Axes are really, really important.
before iron axes were stone axes, and stone axes worked just as well, required more work. You'd have to burn a tree around the base and chip at it with the stone axe till the tree fell. Iron axes were a big, huge improvement because you could go into a forest and just start clearing trees, and you could drop this, it wouldn't break. You can cut dry wood. With a stone axe, you can only cut green trees. With an iron axe, you can not only cut green trees, but you can cut dead trees too, which was a big, huge improvement. Trade axes like these were very popular as well because they're very easily taken apart. If handle breaks, you can easily replace it. If one of these heads gets damaged, you can easily sharpen it or go to a European town and either buy another one or replace it. It's also very easy to put back together again and assemble. So these axes were very, very popular. When they came, these axes were made in England and France. They were made, a lot of the trade axes we know of came from France. They were known as the Biscayne axes, which are a little bit different. This is known as a pole axe, which is more of an English style trade axe. The Biscayne axes, which were really common, are a bit thicker, almost like a modern Swedish carpentry axe. They're a bit thicker. But when axe heads came to North America, they'd be stored in big barrels. They would be put in barrels on ships. They would be made by different guilds. You have to remember, at this time in the 18th century, there is no real factories yet. There's no industrial revolution, so things are made by these small craftsmen in Europe they are given license to make these things by the kings and by the nobility. And these axes would have been axe heads like these guys, and they would have been put into barrels and they would have been put on ships. So when axes were brought to North America, the handles were made here, but barrels of axes, and these axe heads would be bound together in wire, and they would be put into a barrel and they would be shipped over here, and the handles would be made here in North America. By the 18th century, Native people, were not only using these axes for, just regular, just cutting trees, but they were also using them for combat. We know by the 17th century too, even as early as the 1640s, by the 1640s, that Adrian van der Donk talks about how the Native people have given up all their clubs, they've given up bows and arrows for guns and for axes, that they are using axes instead of clubs, which is probably not very true, because we know that clubs go all the way through to the 18th century. There's tons and tons and tons of originals that we've seen that are from the 18th century. So it might be just the natives that van der Donk is talking about might have just had heavy trade and just weren't using wooden clubs. But by the 18th century, there are several different types of axes called prestige axes. And so these axes aren't really used for cutting trees. They're more for combat, or they're more for show. So this one's a later 18th century style prestige axe. And as you can see, it's got, if I can get a little closer, it's got pewter inlays. The handle is very ornate, and so is the axe that we can look. Highly stylized. And this type of axe is meant for combat, but it's also meant for prestige. So when Europeans wanted things from Native people, one of the things that we know that's well recorded is that Europeans would come and they would bring gifts. Gift giving was incredibly, incredibly important in Native society and Native community. No agreement could be made, no agreement could be started without the giving of gifts. And if you wanted the alliance and the allegiance of Native people, you would need to give them gifts and have counsel with them, kudawo. This might take a week, it might take 3 weeks before an answer was given. And it drove the Europeans nuts, drove the English and the French nuts, because they felt, we are giving these gifts for the English, we are giving these gifts to the Indians for them to possibly say no or to not show up. But that was part of the Native way. That was part of our traditional culture, that if you wanted something, you must give something, and you must cement these agreements this way. So if you were an English captain, or if you were a military figure in either of England or France, you might go to a village of Native people, go to their panis, their head warriors or their head elders or their chiefs, and you might gift them prestige axes such as this, and say, with this, accept this gift from, your great father, which was one of the terms used for the kings of England and France, was the great father. Accept this gift of the great father, and know that this axe symbolizes the iron symbolizes our strength. The handle symbolizes, our brotherhood, and that with this axe, know that its keen edge will be used to cut our enemies. Together we give this to you. And there's a lot of elaborate language in these trade ceremonies, but these axes were given to chiefs and to high up warriors as gifts to gain their allegiance in combat and to gain their allegiance in military matters. These axes were very, very important. Another type of prestige axe that we know are really common in this period are the pipe tomahawks. So like these guys, we see these all over the place, and in popular culture. And this is a genuine North American invention. This doesn't exist in Europe. The idea, and it has a multi-layer meaning, this style of axe. So North America is an axe culture because all the forests that we have, clearing trees, and that's, that was one of the ways the European settlers were able to clear land for farming, and, was clearing the trees. So axes were a vital part of North America. But the pipe was also a clearly American invention, because not only are you out in the woods, you're cutting trees, you're also having your time and you're smoking. But this has a multi-layer meaning. So this also means war, and it also means peace. It means both things, because the axe has the ability to cut. It has the ability to strike and to take life, but the pipe has the ability to make peace and to cement that peace and to bring that peace. So this is a symbol of both war and peace at the same time. So Native people really like these pipe tomahawks, and we know that the French in Canada are making these. The military are actually making them, and they're giving them to Native people for alliances and for trade. And later on, in the 18th century, we know that these axes are being sold by European traders. There's many, many different kinds. This is just one example of what some of the pipe axes would look like. We know at places like William Henry, the Native people are using these in combat. They're fighting with these, and they're actually using not only the blade part to strike at people, they're also using the pipe bowl part. There's a couple skulls they recovered, I believe, out of William Henry, that have pipe bowl marks in the skulls of the people they found, that are octagonal pipe bowl marks, where the Native people are literally using the pipe bowl part to smash through the heads of their enemies. So we know Native people are using these well through the 18th century into the 19th century, and they even make their way out west. We know by the 19th century, Western Native people are using pipe tomahawks too, but they had their start here in the 18th century on the East Coast. So if we keep moving, in times of warfare too, we have what's called a prisoner rope. See if I can kind of get that, so you can see a little better. So, people like to believe that, before Europeans, North America was peace, love, and lollipops, that everyone got along and that everything was sweet and nice. And that's a fallacy and a lie. Human beings are pretty gritty. We're pretty rough. And when resources are threatened, human beings aren't nice anymore. And so Native people had a very healthy, normal war culture as well, just like any other race of humans. And so one of the things that Native people, the men, would carry in times of warfare were these guys known as prisoner ropes. You can see the end here, that's wrapped quill work with brass cones and deer hair, and it's a rope. So how does this work? Well, one of the big things when Native people went into warfare, Europeans and Native people had a very different idea of combat. And Europeans sometimes had a very hard time understanding why Native people fought, how they fought, and what they wanted in warfare. For Europeans, it was an idea of total warfare, meaning that you go to a place, wipe out the populace, you burn their town, and you make their betters, their chief officers capitulate and surrender. For Native people, it was really hit and run. Get what you need, maybe burn a house, really don't kill anybody, and just take stuff, and then go back home. We know in the 17th century in the Pequot War that I believe it's John Mason talks about the Native people shooting bows and arrows at each other, fighting with bows in a field. And he said the way they shoot at each other, it would take 100 years for them to kill anybody, because it was more showing bravery and firing arrows. And if somebody died, they died, but the act of it wasn't really meant to kill anybody. Native people did kill people. That was part of it. Men would fight other men, and we would kill them and take their scalps, and that was part of it. But the other big reason for warfare, besides acquiring things, so blankets, knives, kettles, coats, you name it, was also taking captives. Captives were really important. You have to remember, by 1700 to 1763, so many native people were dying of sickness. They were dying of smallpox. They were dying of cholera. They were dying of many European sicknesses that they had no natural immunity to. Imagine meeting 5 native people in the fall, right? Or 10, meeting 10 native people in the fall. You see them leave for the winter time, and then they come back in the spring, and there's only 5. That's how bad these sicknesses were. It was killing literally half of the population every year. And so the Haudenosaunee, as well as some of the Algonkian peoples, had what were known as mourning wars, where they would go on raids in order to take captives to fill the spots of warriors and people who had died of sickness. So many of the raids that happened in New York, that happened in New England, were to take people, children, women, sometimes young men, but generally not. The best captives that were taken were children from 5 to around 12, and women from around, 13 to maybe 19. Why children? Children assimilate into societies really, really well. And a 5-year-old isn't going to remember much of their family before when they get taken, and they will easily become part of native society. Women were taken because so many children had died. Women were needed to repopulate society, and women were taken and given Indian husbands, given Indian families. Men typically were not taken because men would fight back. So men were typically killed in combat, and native men typically saw that it was acceptable in combat to kill other men. Other men are the aggressors, and it's acceptable to take their lives. Children were sometimes killed as well. It depends. We know that native people would kill children when they were infants, because if they were going to take them captive and take them to Canada, the babies wouldn't live. A newborn wasn't going to live on a 180-mile trek to Quebec. And so typically we would kill the infants so that they would have a quick death instead of a slow death. But children were taken, women were taken, and oftentimes when they were taken, you would put, children were tended to be, what's recorded that children were carried. They were either carried on the shoulders of the native warriors who would just, like we would do at a fairground with our kids, put them on our shoulders. So imagine seeing a war party that took kids, right? That had like 5 kids, and you see these, guys who look like me. I'm not very tall, but I'm pretty broad and strong. And imagine me with a 5-year-old over my shoulder running, or at a good pace, at a good walk with a 5-year-old on my shoulders. And that's what it would look like. You'd see 4 or 5 guys with 5, 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds on their shoulders carrying these kids. Or they would have these kids or women, they would tie their hands with prisoner ropes, and they would drag them with them. Some of the prisoner ropes went over the neck. We also know native people took captives in order for ritual killing. And the ritual killing was to avenge the death of all of those who had died, not only in combat, but in sickness. And so it was seen as a spiritual killing, that you were killing them in a spiritual way to reclaim the lost spiritual energy of the warriors and children who had died. And so we know that some of these people were burned alive. Some of them were skinned alive, pretty gruesome stuff. And these were ritual killings that were meant to appease the spirits and to appease the spirits of those who had died in combat. But by this time period, 1700, 1763, for, 80 years, going all the way to the end of the 1600s, captives were being taken from New York, New England, and brought to Canada, brought to northern New England. And we know by the end of this program, 1763, you get the Accords of 1763, where the British government asked the native people to return these captives. And the problem was, so imagine you're a 5-year-old in, say, 1745 in King George's War, right? And you're 5. And you're taken by a group of Mohicans who attack your town, and they kill your family, and they take you. Now, you've lived your entire life as a native person. You've lived your life as a Mohican. You know nothing of, you barely remember English. You barely remember what it was like to live in an English town. And imagine being told that you must leave this family in 1763, that you must leave this family. You don't speak English anymore. You speak just Mohican. And in the eyes of the other Mohicans, you are Mohican. You are not English or French anymore, or Dutch. You are Mohican now. And to leave your family. Imagine being pulled from your family, being told you must go back to the English town that you came from. these children were terrified, and a lot of them ran away. And they went back with their Indian families. Some of them just sickened and died because they were just so distraught. But we know that a lot of these captives, they stayed with especially they were taken as children. The older people, teenagers and young adults, tended to go back to English towns, but the children stayed because they knew no other life than being an Indian. They knew no other life than that. And so by this time period, 1700 to 1763, it wouldn't have been uncommon to see a war party of native people with one European guy who's all painted up and had Indian haircut, his ears were pierced, he was tattooed, but he had red hair. But in the eyes of those people, that man was a full-blooded native person. There was no difference. And that's part of our traditional culture. We had a strong tradition of adoption. We know with James Smith, who was taken in 1754 by a party of Shawnees and Lenapes. He was given to a Mohawk family in Ohio. We know from he writes about what they did. He ran the gauntlet. The gauntlet was something we would do for the older, usually younger men, where you would be stripped down either naked or down to your breechcloth or your skivvies. You would have a line of warriors going out, and they would have sticks and axe handles, and they would scream and they would yell, they would give war cries at you, and they would beat you as hard as they could. And you were told to run, and you were told to stand and run, not to fall or cry. We admired strength in the individual. And the reason for it, this was another form of ritual killing. So when you beat that person, it was, in a sense, ritually and spiritually killing them and killing the offending spirit that had took the lives of the other warriors and children that had been lost to disease and combat. And when this person made it through the gauntlet, they were seen as a new person. They were seen as spiritually clean, and they were then ready to be adopted. And if they came through, they didn't cry, they moved, and they just ran through. They were seen as a strong individual who would make a strong person to be a part of their tribe, their community. James Smith writes that when he is taken by the women. They bring him to the water. They wash and scrub his body with sand. A man then comes and they give him Indian clothing, and they pluck his hair. So a man puts ashes. He has a bark plate, and he has ashes from the fire, and they pluck his hair like turkey feathers, and they give him an Indian haircut. And so he's brought before the chief of the tribe that he's given to, the Mohawk, the party of Mohawks, and the man says to him, he's like, "You are now the flesh of our flesh, the bone of our bone. All of your white blood has been washed away, and you are now part of a great new family." And this is how Native people really saw it. We had a strong sense of adoption. And in their eyes, James Smith was now Squaw. He was now a full-blooded Mohawk man with all the rights, privileges, and abilities of a Mohawk man. It did not matter that he was English by birth. And so adoption was incredibly, incredibly important. But prisoner ropes like this would have been worn in times of combat and in times of raids. If you saw a party of native men with clubs at their back and prisoner ropes on their belt, it was time for you to lock your doors and go in your house, because it meant they were taking captives and they were taking people. But this was a part of our culture, and we did this even before Europeans. So prisoner ropes were important. So in times of combat, we also have times where peace is needed and agreements are needed. So we then go into Wampum, Wapumpiaq. So I'll bring out this belt here. So this is a copy of the Penn Treaty belt, which is a 17th century wampum belt. But belts like these, there were many different kinds. And so wampum comes from the word Wapumpiaq. So you can see my pretty face. So wampum comes from the word Wapumpiaq, which means white shell bead. It comes from my language. Our word is peak or peg, which means just white shell bead. Originally, it was the whelk shell bead. So a whelk or a conch, the Italians call it scungili, is a type of ocean snail that's actually really tasty. You can eat it, but we would use the center column of the shell, and we would traditionally make a bead from it. You could also use the sides of the shell, and you could make ornaments, earring pieces, what have you. And later on, we use the quahog shell. So the quahog comes from this clam, this bivalve known as the quahog clam. It's very delicious, but we would also use the shell because it has this natural purple. See if I can actually get you a better shell so you can see the purple a little bit better. Here, this you can see the purple a little bit better. Purple is one of the rarest colors in nature, and that's why we highly valued it. It's beautiful. So wampum had a great important significance, and it was something that a lot of Europeans, another one, that they had a very, very, very hard time understanding. And it's not their fault. You have to remember that Europeans come from a world of guilders, farthings, ducats. You know, they come from a world of gold, copper, and silver. So, and wampum had no real value, not in the same way to Native people. And so when Europeans saw Native people who valued wampum, wampum for them was not only beautiful, so it was worn just sheerly for its beauty. It is if you look at these beads that I have, these are the real wampum that I have. See if I can get a better picture for you. You know, these are beautiful beads. They're absolutely beautiful. The color, the texture, they're absolutely beautiful. And they were worn for their beauty, but also wampum was seen as a living object. It was seen as a spiritual, sacred object. Wampum was used for everything. It was used for making strands that told people who you were, who you're related to. It was used for condolences. When people died, children died, you would give that person gifts of wampum. Wampum was made into strands, and it was used when you were in council, kudowo, and it was also woven into belts to signify agreements and treaties and to signify that. And so these belts and these strands were seen as living objects. They were seen as living things. They weren't seen as, just a static kind of object. They were seen as real living things. And so wampum was really, really important for Native people. And when you were in council, what you were expected to hold. So who's ever heard the term honest Injun? Who's ever heard that term before? Have you heard the term before, Victoria? No? So it's an
No, I
old
don't
term.
think so, but yeah.
It's an old term. Well, first of all, the word Injun, which we think is a derogatory word, it's the Dutch word for Indian. They called them either Natrellen, they called them Injen, which just literally in Dutch means Indian, or Heathen, heathens, or Wilden, which means wild person, wild man, Wildmenschen. And so honest Injun, the term for it, native Algonkian and Iroquoian people did not lie. That was a big tenet of our traditional culture, was to not lie. Well, why is that important? Well, and ancient European cultures were like this too. The Celtic cultures were all, Nordic cultures were all like this too. If you were an animist and you believe that all things around you are alive, right? All things around you are living, from the grass to the soil to the stones to the trees to the birds, and all of them have a spirit. All of them are also related to you, and the world is populated by good and bad spirits. Well, that means your words that you say are incredibly important, because that means in this world of spirits that everything is listening to you when you speak, and that some of these beings, these spirit Manatu and Iniwak, these spirit beings, are so old they go beyond the time of human beings, and their memories are perfect, and they can recall if you told a lie, because they know all of your ancestors from the time immemorial. They know all of those things because they've been around since the time of the earth. And so lying was something that was really bad, because the spirits would know if you were lying. And that could also mean that it could bring bad things. The bad spirits would come to your community and make people sick because you lied, because you didn't tell the truth. It could also mean that your ancestors would no longer hear you because you dishonored them, you disrespected them, and that they would no longer come and hear your words when you were in prayer and you needed them. So lying was really, really bad. Lying was something that was not tolerated, and lying was something that was seen as really disrespectful and really wrong. And so when Native people were in council, they didn't lie, and they would hold their wampum strands, and they would hold their belts, and they would speak the truth. And so that's where we get this term, honest Injun, because the Indians didn't lie. And sometimes with Europeans, that hurt them because they didn't lie. They didn't tell a false truth. And that was because of that, because they believe all things are listening to me. One of my elders said to me once, he said, when you pray, be very careful with how you pray and what you say, because your words circle around the entire earth and then come back at you. So be very careful with what you ask for, because if you ask for it in the wrong way, so if I said, you know, I prayed very hard to have $1 million, well, I might get that $1 million, but my mother might have to die for me to get that $1 million. And that was the lesson he told me, was that you need to be very careful with how you pray. And that's that idea of honesty. And with wampum, and wampum was a way to signify that truth. So wampum belts were very important, were a very, very important way. And they were seen as living objects. They were seen as physically alive, and they were living agreements. So there were belts that signified many things. So we have, this one's the Penn Treaty belt, which was made with the Lenape and William Penn. And how this reads, so it's the Lenape here and William Penn over here in the English, and it says that the Lenape and the English will live together as brothers. When you read belts, what we have, it's recorded, is people holding them this way. There's actually images of wampum readers doing it this way. Wampum belts are read down. The reading of wampum belts is incredibly important, and it has to be done very carefully, because each segment of the belt, especially if it's a complex belt, each tribe or each clan has a place on that belt. And if you forget where their place is, it's a great insult to that community and to those people. So you have to remember very carefully who's in that belt. So one, for instance, that I have is this one, which is the Tuscarora Treaty belt. And how this one reads is that the Tuscarora, the Meherrin, and the Nottoway are three people that lived in North Carolina at one time. They fought, this was hundreds of years ago, they fought with each other, and they killed each other to the point where they lost almost all their culture, and they said we shouldn't fight each other and we should be brothers and unify. So the Tuscarora, the Meherrin, and the Nottoway agreed to unify and to be brothers and to share each other's borders for time immemorial, going all the way down. And that's how you read this belt. Now, if you're with the Tuscarora are always on top. If you're with the Meherrin, because the Meherrin claim that they created this belt, the Meherrin are on top. And you have to remember these things when you read these belts, because they are living objects and they're living agreements. We have other belts that signify other things. So this is a war belt. So this has a double meaning. So one side is painted red. So let's see if I can get a little closer, we can see. One side is painted red, the other is white. So this belt signifies this is the white pipe of peace. And so the white pipe, when this was brought out, and the white pipe of peace was brought, this is a peace belt. This means that we're no longer going to fight, that we are burying our hatchets, which you've probably heard that term, burying the hatchet. That comes from Hiawatha. That comes from the great peacemaker, who they buried all their hatchets in order to create the great peace of the Iroquois. But when the peace belt was brought out, the white peace belt, the white pipe was there, and it was showed we are no longer going to fight. We are showing our unity. We are showing our friendship, that we are no longer going to fight. The white pipe of peace is brought out. But in times of war, this belt would be flipped. And now it's the red tomahawk. And now it's the bloodied tomahawk, which means that it's a time of war, that we are choosing to go to war, that we bloody and redden our tomahawks for combat. And so this belt also has both not only the white strands, but the red strands as well, that show both peace and war. And so these belts were very important. And in times of combat, if you were living in a native village, so say Victoria, you were taken as a captive in, let's say, a Mohican village in, say, 1740, right? And so if you saw a runner come with this belt and it was the red side out, you would know that war was coming, that he's carrying a war belt. And the runners would carry these belts, and runners would run for miles and miles, hundreds of miles, carrying these messages. And the runner would say, you know, the Lenape are going to war, and they ask the Mohicans for their assistance, and they give you this belt as they ask for your assistance. Or they might flip it and say peace has been brought to the Lenapes, and they ask for you to come to Kutuo, to come to council to agree on this great peace that they have made. And so you would know what was going on just by these belts, you know, whether it was peace or war, you would know what was going on. There's also other types of belts. There's belts that are used for marriages, that are belts that are used for other things. So this is more of a contemporary belt that was made by a very good friend of mine, who's part of a living history unit I belong to, and it's a friendship belt. So this belt symbolizes myself and my two friends, and the third object here is our traditions. and it continues time immemorial. So all three of us are connected by our traditions, which continues for time immemorial. And that's the meaning of this belt. And so some belts have that meaning. And there's other ones that are like this one, which is the betrothal belt. This one I'm not very sure how to read. It's one that I've copied from an original, but there are many different kinds. This one's a betrothal belt, so one that you would give when you were willing to take a wife. So it was seen that when a man was ready to take a woman to be his wife, he was expected. So we were a matrilineal culture, meaning that the women governed a lot of our life, and that your heritage was determined by your mother's ancestry. Your clan was determined by your mom. So if your mom was Bear Clan, you were Bear Clan. Your father's clan didn't really matter. You were taken in by your mother's clan. I was raised by my mom. So my mom and my mother's clan is who raised me. In real life, my mom and my mother's family raised me. And it's my mother's blood that's my native heritage that's through me. And so when a man went to go and have a wife, he would present that woman's aunt, because the aunt and uncle were seen as the ones who raised the children. Mom and dad were second teachers because mom and dad are too close to kids. And so aunt and uncle were seen as the ones who would really raise children. And so aunt and uncle, the man would come and he would bring furs, he would bring meat. One of the ones that traditional is he would bring venison to the aunt and the grandmother and the sisters. And that was to show that he was going to provide for her for time immemorial, that he was going to provide, and she would give him corn. And the corn was saying that she would provide for him for time immemorial, and they would exchange these. And this was known as a courtship. That was known for the Mohawks as a courtship. And that's baskets for one that I've heard of among some of the Algonkian peoples, giving of baskets. It's the same idea that I give to you, I will hunt for you and provide for you, and you will provide for me. But wampum was also exchanged, and so was other things. And it was to show that I will provide for her forever, as my wife. Most native people were monogamous, but we do know chiefs were polygamous. We know that a lot of chiefs did have many wives, especially the Algonkian chiefs, the sachems in Weerwance's clan chiefs were known to have many wives. Were known to have 3 or 4. And if we keep moving to the right, so one of the other big trade items that native people really wanted are firearms. So this is a French style musket. It's a Saint-Étienne military musket. It's a 1690s style gun, but these guns were used all the way through into the 18th century. 62 caliber, 20 gauge. The native people really liked French muskets, French guns. They were a lot lighter than English firearms. And if you're, a typical native man can walk 30 miles in a day. And so if you're walking 30 miles in a day, you don't want to carry a 9-pound gun. You want to carry something that's maybe 6 or 10. And so guns like these were really, really desirable. It's smoothbore, meaning that the barrel is just a tube connected to a firing mechanism. This is the most common type of gun for the period. Rifling comes much later. It's also really expensive. It's really hard to do because you have to twist the barrel. You have to have a blacksmith who can do that instead of just making a tube that's connected to a firing mechanism. But firearms were really, really important. And we know even by the early 17th century, native peoples are trading for firearms and they're using firearms and they're not using bows and arrows nearly as much. But firearms are really important. We know native people have English guns, French guns. In the 17th century, we know they have Dutch guns. They have all different kinds of firearms. But most native people, the vast majority of men would have had firearms with them, but they would have also been using bows and arrows for hunting as well. But that's so to make this firearm work, you need powder horn and you need a shot bag. So the powder horn is made from cow horn. From what we understand, native people are just making these. They don't trade for them. They're just making powder horns. No one really knows how or why or when it starts. They just are. I assume that's either they just, if you can make a horn rattle, which we know by the 18th century, native people are making rattles with cow horn. if you can figure out how to make this, you can figure out how to make this. And that's what I assume is how that happened. But powder horns are really important. This holds your gunpowder. Why a horn? Well, first of all, horns are non-ferrous, meaning they don't spark. Gunpowder is really, really explosive, and exploding gunpowder is bad. You don't want to be carrying something that under your arm that's full of gunpowder that can explode. That's really bad. That's going to put a hole in your body and you will die. So powder horns are also important because horns are waterproof. The powder will stay nice and dry. This is my personal powder horn, which I hunt with and use. And there actually is gunpowder in here. I don't know if you can hear that sound. There's actually gunpowder in there. Native powder horns tend to be, sometimes plain. They have no scrimshaw or designs on them. And sometimes they have tons of designs on them. So on my powder horn, I have a couple scrimshaw designs. So I have on here, you can see it. I don't know how clear that is. You can see my name. Native people they didn't have a written language, so they would write pictures that would show their names. So I have my name. I have a second name that was given to me by a Mohican community, which is Otter. I also have the trout lilies that are there. Where I grew up in Western Connecticut, trout lilies were a really common springtime flower. And so I put them on my powder horn. On the bottom are the stars, Nitompumahempus, my relations, the stars, who watch over me in the night sky. And then I have an image of a turkey, which is an animal I wish to acquire with my gun while I go hunt. Powder horns a lot of times told people, the warrior who carried them, it told people who that warrior was related to, where they came from, what tribe they came from, what clan they belonged to, spiritual society. They might even have spiritual things to protect the warrior while they were out hunting or in war. You have to remember too, warfare was seen as another spiritual kind of thing. When you're out in combat, you're regarded as a different kind of spiritual being because you're in a different mindset. So when you came back to a village, traditionally, there was a whole protocol how to deal with men who had come back from the war party because they were filled with combat spirits, that they were filled with that energy, and they were not, in the sense, they were not clean to be part of the community again. So there was a way to, they had to, be treated differently when they came back from warfare. And so combat items like these were seen as, having a lot of spiritual power too. So you might have things on here to protect the owner while he was out in war party, he was out on raids, that would protect him and keep him safe. Shot bag too is pretty decorated. Some of these are relatively plain. Some of these are a lot of these are highly decorated. So we look at mine. Mine has those 5-0 beads. It also has brass cones with glass wampum, dyed red deer hair. Dyed red deer hair is really, really common for Native people. We know through the 16 and 1700s, it's what ornaments almost everything Eastern woodland is dyed red deer hair. Red because it's a social color, sacred color, and that continues all the way to the present time. So this bag has some quill work on it, made from soaked porcupine quills that are then sewn. So it has my name that's on there. That's upside down when you look at it this way, but when you're wearing it, you can see it. It's facing your face. We also have trout lilies that are on there. If you flip the bag open, this geometric pattern is just, I made this bag in the wintertime many years ago, so it's to symbolize the snow. The fish are to symbolize, because my people were fishermen, so it symbolizes the fish that we hunted. The eyes are all different on the fish to symbolize that all things in life are different, that no two things are the same. And the bottom are the red cardinal flowers that exist on our riverbanks in Western Connecticut. So inside the bag, you would have tools to clean your gun, extra gun flints. You would have extra tools to fix the gun. You would carry shot, which is just a small bag for shot. You would also carry molds, shot mold, and you would carry lead spoons, so that when you're out on war party and raid and you have a fire going, you can make more ammunition. You just have to melt lead. So you might carry some little pieces of lead in here to make extra shot. Or you would go to the battlefield and you would pick out all the lead balls and you would melt those down and make more shot that way. So you would carry you would carry lead spoons and shot molds with you. You might also carry turkey call with you, which you could use in combat to move troops. We know that Native people were known for using bird calls when they would do troop movements through the forest. And so turkey call might mean for the men to hold back. It might mean them for the move forward. It might mean a bunch of different things. But we know Native people were using bird calls, which our modern military, I believe, still does. We know a lot of the Ranger Corps, Green Berets, take a lot from Native combat. But this is also used for hunting as well, for attracting turkeys as well. But you would also carry in here, maybe extra patches. You just carry, regular firearm supplies just to keep your gun in working order and to keep it working. And lastly, we also have a scalp. So a lot of people, especially in the times we live in, people are all real iffy about scalps and scalping. But this is a part of Native culture. This is a part of traditional Native culture that goes to before contact. We know even that early Europeans talk about Native people who headhunted. And headhunting kind of seems phased out around the mid 17th century. But scalping was really important. So this is a reproduction. This is not a real human scalp. But scalps were important. Now, why doing that? Well, you have to remember yet again, we're going to go back to animism. Animism is really important. And it guides most ideologies for Native people. And there's also, in this world of animism, many things have spiritual power. Animal parts, claws, paws, certain pelts have spiritual power that can aid a warrior or a hunter in battle or in hunting. A warrior might wear a bobcat pelt or wear bobcat claws because bobcats are good hunters and they're silent. And that warrior might want the power of that bobcat and would carry their pelts or their claws and believe that their energy was given to them. So they would have this prowess that the bobcat has, and that they would have the spiritual power that the bobcat has. Hair was another one. Hair for Eastern Woodland people symbolized the vitality and the strength of that warrior. So the longer and healthier your hair was, it showed how spiritually powerful you were. And it also protected that sacred spot in your head. And so when warriors would take scalps, you were literally taking the spiritual energy of your enemy and keeping it and taking it with you. So literally by having their scalp, you literally own that warrior's spiritual power, which is like, whoa, that's a big deal. And so when warriors took scalps, traditionally, it was to take the spiritual powers of their enemies and to carry that spiritual power with them. Europeans later on monopolized the Native people who already took scalps and profiteered off of it and told Native people to take more scalps in order for them to create a total war, which Native people thought was a foreign concept to them. But scalp and scalp taking was very, very common. It was a reality of the 17th and 18th century. And if you were in times of war in a Native camp in a village, you might see a warrior scalp pole, which would have been outside of their lodge or on their lodge, or in their lodge, which would have showed the scalps that they had taken. Some of them were European scalps, some of them were Native scalps. We know that Mary Jemison, who was taken by the Senecas in the 1750s, talks about the warrior stretching her mother and her sister's scalps and stretching out the scalps and stretching them out and putting them on little racks that they would carry with them. And it was, her mom had red hair, and that's how she knew it was her mom's hair, because it was a red braid. It's gritty, but it's reality. It's reality for that time period. And it's a reality that in modern times we have a hard time looking at. But in the 17th and 18th century, it was something that was seen. This was a part of that culture. This was something that they did. But it had spiritual energy, and that's why you took those scalps. So we were talking about firearms, and we were talking about, so by this time period, we still do have bows and arrows. Bows and arrows still do exist, though they are not nearly as common as firearms. So this is what's known as a flat bow. It's called a flat D bow. Flat bow because it has no handle section. It's just one flat piece of wood. To make an Eastern style of bow, it's made from one solid tree. It's made from one tree trunk. And it's carved out. It takes 6 months to make a bow just to let the wood dry. So if you cut a piece of wood in June or July, you'd have to wait till the wintertime to start working on it, because otherwise it's going to warp and not work too well. But bows were used for hunting. They were used by young men and young warriors for hunting. They are a silent weapon. The only problem is the reason why they go away. You have to learn how to make one of these things. You have to be taught by your uncle or your grandfather or your father how to make this thing. And if everybody's dying of sickness and warfare, there's no one to show you how to do this. So firearms, one of those things that you could go to an English trading post or a French trading post, bring a season's worth of beaver pelts, and we know that one firearm was 2 beaver pelts. And if you already have 30, Adrian Vanderdonk talks of 80,000 beaver pelts a year. 80,000, which is a lot, and that's a year. And this is the 1640s. By this time period, the fur trade's going, it's not nearly what it was. But if we know Native people are coming to trading posts with 1 or 2 or 10 beaver pelts, and one gun is 2 beaver pelts, you could get 5 if you bring 20 or 30 beaver pelts with you. So bows and arrows were used by the younger men, young warriors who didn't have firearms. We know James Smith, Squaw, was given a bow and arrow when he was living with the Mohawks. They didn't trust him with a gun, so they gave him a bow. But we know also, even through the Rev War, that we know the Stockbridge Mohicans are using bows and arrows with their firearms. They carry bows and arrows with them. The quiver is made from folded ash, so it's a basket. It's called a basket quiver. It's made the same way you would make an ash splint basket, except it's made into a tube. And your arrows have, there's many different kinds of arrows. So this is a typical 17th, 18th century style arrow. Eastern arrows were known for 2 fletch, meaning that they only have 2 feathers on them, not your typical 3. Why that is, I don't know. The ones that we have that are in collections that are known are 2-fletched, and they work fine for hunting. I've shot 2-fletched arrows for years, and they work just as well as 3-fletched arrows. The point on there is a trade point made of metal. This one's made out of copper. They were also being made out of brass. Stone points were really phased out by this time period. No one was making chipped flint points anymore. That really stopped with European contact. Because before you would have seen points, like this one. This one's made from stone. Or see if I have a better example of more of a pre-contact style stone point. I think this one. Hold on. Yeah, this one. This one's more of a pre-contact style stone point. I made all these stone points, by the way. But that's known as a Madison Point, which is, it's a little tiny triangle, but this is more common to like early 1600s. But by this time period, no one is really chipping stone points anymore. Not on the East Coast. No one is doing that. They're all using cut trade points made from brass or from iron or from copper. They're making mostly from brass and copper. They're making trade points. But bows and arrows are being used all the way through to the Revolutionary War, but typically they were used for hunting when you were near your village and near those places. Before I continue, is there any questions that people have?
We do have one question that actually just came through the chat. So the question is, approximately when did the Algonkian peoples arrive in New York and New England? Do we know where they migrated from, and were they followed by the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois?
As far as we know, it depends on the group. So I'm from Western Connecticut. I know a bit about some of Connecticut history. And what we know is recorded from Uncas, who was the paramount sachem of the Mohegans, who was also Pequot. He gave his, before he died in like the 1650s, he told the English his entire lineage, because he was a royal Pequot. And he claims that the Pequots originally were Mohicans and that they came from the Hudson Valley in the 1540s and they migrated east. Now, the Pequots and the Mohicans have an oral tradition of this, where the Mohicans say they are the Wolf Clan, and they are the Wolf Clan because they were part of the Iroquois, and that they originally came from New York. And Uncas backs this up by saying, yes, we did come from the Hudson Valley, and we migrated east in the 1540s. So they were relative newcomers by the 17th century to eastern Connecticut. From what we understand, the majority of Algonkian people come to New York and New England during the Ice Age. They are not the people that we would recognize today. There's not much known about Paleo-Indian people, as one can imagine, because all we know of them is the artifacts they leave behind. We don't know their language. We don't know their culture. We can only assume, which is not really that great. But from what we understand, the tribes that we are familiar with today really form 13, 14, 15, 1600s. The tribes that we really know today are really formed 15, 1600s. And that's like when Europeans get here, and that's kind of, when they kind of become what we know today. But, our tribes have been here for 11, 12,000 years. The Haudenosaunee too have been in upstate New York, and even as far east as Connecticut, Western Connecticut, and other places for 11, 12,000 years.
Thank you. I do have another question that's come
Yes.
through. Other than for the European clothing they traded for, did the men make their own clothing and moccasins, and did they do their own beading and quilling?
Women did all that for us. And it's really well recorded that the women made all the clothes. I remember reading that there was one French journal from, I believe it was an officer, who says that the Indian women are magnificent seamstresses, that their stitching is beautiful, that the way they sew things is absolutely beautiful. But our women made all their clothes, they tanned all the leather, they took care of the children, they raised all the corn, beans, and squash, and they did all the beadwork, and they did all the quill work, where it was done by the women. In contemporary culture, both men and women do quill work and beadwork and make all the clothes, like my leggings and everything I have. I made a lot of what I had. But my woman braids my hair, and that's part of traditional culture. It was seen that only your wife, that only your mother or your female kin could touch your hair. That if another woman touched your hair, not only is it an affront to the woman you're married to, because she is touching your spiritual power, but that also she is claiming you as her man. And that is seen as a great big thing of disrespect. In traditional culture, only a mother, an aunt, a wife, a sister could touch your hair. No one else could do that. So women were vital to our society and culture. But traditionally, women did all of those things. They made the moccasins, but men would have known how to repair their moccasins and how to fix them. But the beading and sewing were really done by the women traditionally. Now in contemporary culture, both men and women do these things.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Would anyone like to unmute themselves briefly and ask a question that way if you're more comfortable? Okay, I don't see anyone unmuting. So if you'd like to
Sure, I'll
continue.
So as we move farther back, so one of the things I have a lot, which is I'll try to move my camera so we can see. Yet again, one of the little fun things about Zoom. So one of the things I have with me are pelts. So by this time period, the fur trade is pretty much dead on the East Coast. The peak of fur trade is really from 1620 to around 1660 is the peak of the fur trade. Furs are still coming in, but by this time period, 1700 to 1763, it's mostly coming from the Great Lakes, from the Ojibwa, the Menominee, and the Sauk, the Fox, all these Great Lakes tribes, even the Dakotas. Believe it or not, New France stretched from Quebec all the way to the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, and went as far south as Louisiana and south as Illinois, which is ridiculous. Where New England
stretched from like New Brunswick all the way to South Carolina, you know, like they were a thumb compared to the arm that was Canada. Canada was a huge, huge threat. And a lot of the things I have are French trade items because France made a lot of good stuff. They made very far superior knives and kettles and axes and guns than the English did, and the native people really liked the French goods. The French were also treated native people a lot better, which was another big alliance between native people and Europeans. But furs were still coming in. The ones that were most desirable were beaver furs, which were being turned into hats. Used the fur felt, which was more of a 17th century fashion, still continued into the 18th century. Obviously, since we're talking about Albany Museum of Art, Beaverbick, which was in Albany, which is named simply, and also the crest of New Netherlands was the beaver because of the beaver pelt. And these were coming by this time period from the Great Lakes. New York had almost extirpated all of their beavers by the 1660s. They had almost wiped them completely out. So we know that the fur trade's really coming from the Great Lakes. But furs were really important. This was the major economy for native people. And we get to a lot of these warfares and conflicts with native people in the 18th century because the fur trade dries up and native people don't have a way to acquire goods. And for 80 years, they slowly becoming more and more and more dependent upon European trade goods to the point where they couldn't produce anything themselves. They were so dependent on guns and gunpowder and lead and European cloth, they were forgetting how to make things for themselves. And so you get into all these conflicts and you get into all these warfares and combat situations because native people are literally fighting for the materials and the resources that they need to survive. And the fur trade was almost over, which was the way that they knew how to buy things from the Europeans. Because otherwise, besides the furs, native people didn't really have anything by this time period that Europeans wanted. So furs were vitally important to native people. And by 1700, the standards for the fur trade changed. So prior to 1700, it's really kind of a hodgepodge. So imagine Victoria, I'm using you as my lovely assistant and example. You run a trading post, right? And so at this time, native people are just bringing whatever they got. So they're bringing beaver pelts, they're bringing raccoon pelts, they're bringing, such as these guys, they're bringing raccoon pelts, they're bringing squirrel pelts, they're bringing chipmunk skins, they're bringing pounds of feathers. We know this from a document from 1700 from the New York, I believe, the New York Historical Society. That's a trade ledger that actually talks about 15 pounds of feathers are equivalent to one beaver skin, that 8 chipmunk skins are equivalent to one beaver skin. It gets really, a pound of castoreum of beaver oil is one beaver skin. It gets really, really confusing. And so a man comes around, his name is a very famous guy, his name is Sir William Johnston. Sir William Johnston of Johnston Hall, friend of the Mohawks, who marries into the Brant family. He's a really innovative Irishman, you know. And Johnston says, you know, the system that we have with the Indians of fur trade is just daffy. It's just bonkers. And there's no standards to this. And by this time, most of the other furs, the raccoons, the beavers, it's all drying up. A lot of these furs are coming out of Ohio too, bear skins too. And so Johnston says, well, the Indians mostly are bringing in deer skins, either leather deer skins or they're bringing hair-on deer skins. And so he changed to the buck system. So the deer skin, the buck skin, becomes the new symbol of currency, becomes the new center of currency. And so we get the expression, well, that costs a buck, from a leftover of Sir William Johnston's buck system, which he equates deer skins like this guy as what he wants for trade for items, because that's the majority of what's coming in from West Virginia, from the Ohio, from the Great Lakes, are deer skins, are what's coming in. And that's what they're using now for trade. So we're speaking as well as, since we hinted at the note of currency, so going back to wampum, we're kind of backtracking a little bit. So Europeans, when they come here in the 17th century, even through to the 18th century, you can't mint coins in North America, which causes a whole heck of a lot of problems. Most of these Europeans are very, very, very poor. You have to remember, by the 17th and 18th century, Europe is really no different than Guatemala in a lot of different aspects. People are generally really poor. They're mostly farmers. They live hand to mouth. And what's different from today's society is that they have a lord or a king that they are subject to. And if you're a regular European farmer in Europe, half of what you grow goes to your lord or your nobleman, and the other half you have to sell. So only a quarter of what you eat is what you grow as your food. People were horribly, horribly malnourished. And so the only currency that was legal was Dutch, French, English currency was legal. In America, you could not mint any currency. This was a crown offense, and you were hanged for treason because you were minting counterfeit. And so what did people do? Well, the Dutch start the system of equating wampum, Swan, to currency because they know the native people value it, they trade for it, they desire it. And so the Dutch, who have no concept of, wampum being a social, spiritual object, they're like, okay, we can equate this to guilders, farthings, ducats. And they literally weigh them out and they say, 18 beads of black wampum is equivalent to 5 ducats. And 14 beads of white swan is equivalent to 10 ducats. And if you multiply this by 7, you will get 1 guilder of wampum. And it gets really confusing. In the 17th century, the Dutch are it gets really, really confusing. Just the mathematical equations and equivalencies of switching wampum to currency, and also beaver purse to currency. But the English also carry on this system into the 18th century of wampum being used as a currency because you couldn't mint coins. And in very rural parts of colonial America, where you might have not had access to guilders, farthings, ducats, you would use wampum because you knew the Indians valued wampum, and you would use wampum as a currency. And believe it or not, the United States was using wampum as a currency all the way through to the early 1800s, when we stopped officially using it as a legal tender, legal currency. But as we move farther back on this blanket, so one of the other things that we have, so you keep seeing me swig out of my gourd. So gourds are another thing that native people, we grew many things in our garden. Our women were the ones who grew the pecatowas, the Algonkian, the macaque, the corn, beans, and the squash. Men were in charge of growing the apawak. It was seen that men were supposed to grow the apawak because men had to understand what it was to grow something, since women are the natural growers and tenders of life. Even if a woman cannot bear children, she's still responsible for raising the children, whether it be her sister's children or not. And women are the natural growers of life. So men, it was seen, must understand what it was to grow something, to understand what it is to tend and to care for something. So it was their job to grow the tobacco. But women were the ones who grew the corn, beans, and squash and supplied all the food for the men. They also cleaned and cooked all the food that the men hunted and fished. But gourds were one of those things that the women also grew in their gardens. So gourds, it's called a bottle gourd or a gooseneck gourd. Gourds like these were really important. So you plant these seeds, right around now to early June. You have to treat the vines, make sure the vines don't break. And from a couple seeds, you can get 50 to 100 gourds. Now, of those 50 to 100 gourds, half might die, quarter might die, but the ones that don't, they're going to rot and get all nasty. But the ones that don't will be nice and hard, and you dry them in your lodge. And what you do is you cut the top off of them, take a stick, scrape out the inside, shake out all the seeds and all the membrane that's inside because it's really bitter and it'll make you sick. And you have a water container that's relatively hard, can hold, close to a gallon of water, and keeps it relatively cool for most of the day. Gourds like these were used mostly in villages and mostly around where people, because they're fragile. I mean, I can't bash this next to a tree and expect it to be solid. It's going to break. It's made from a plant. But for what it is, it's very hardy. Gourds were used for bowls. They were used for water containers. They were used for dippers. And people were using gourds for stuff all throughout North America up till the 20th century. In rural parts of Appalachia, people were using gourds as water dippers, which is a continuation of native people using gourds for different things. This gourd is painted. We know from the John White paintings of the 1500s that they had painted gourds. So we know that gourds had decoration to them, that they had painting designs on them, as well as just being plain. We know the Canadian militia were also using, the militia in Canada were also using gourd water bottles and containers.
I do just want to jump in quickly and say we are around 2:30. I would be more than happy to continue on. And I also just wanted to also be able to open it up to any other questions that people, the conversation up to questions that other people have. I did receive one.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I had a question asking what is the difference between Mohican with an A and Mohican with an O?
That's a great question. So they're both two Algonkian peoples. The Mohicans are a larger, from what I understand, the Mohicans are their own separate tribe. They're their own separate people, where the Mohicans are a much bigger family of people that stretched all the way into Western Connecticut and into the Hudson Valley, that then get pushed to the Ohio and Wisconsin area. And some of them do stay around here in Western Connecticut and parts of the Hudson Valley. But they have a very, well, Mohicans have a large language family that stretches all the way to almost the Great Lakes. That is from as far east as Western Connecticut to as far west as, the Great Lakes.
Thank you. Are there a number of fluent Mohican language speakers?
I believe in Wisconsin there are. I know the Ramapos are learning Lenape from folks in Canada. I believe there are in Wisconsin, but I don't know for a fact.
What would have been used to paint the gourds?
Well, same ochre that I use for my face. You could use to paint the gourds. You could also, I have black on here, you could use from charcoal, and but also we know Vanderdonk talks about all the different pigments that native people use from plants. Unfortunately, in the 1640s, Vanderdonk did not know what kind of plants they were using, which is unfortunate to us now because a lot of that knowledge is lost. But Vanderdonk talks about purples and yellows and a variety of dyes being created from plants that native people use.
I also do just want to share, I have several compliments as well. Gail said, thank you, Drew, greatly appreciated, fascinating. And Mark says, thank you. Trying to see if I see any other, does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, anything, please feel free to ask anything. And
Not seeing anything quite yet. Kate said, excellent presentation. Thank you, Drew. I have a question.
yes.
What is the most common misconception that you sort of get questioned about?
I think the most common one that I get is that, Europeans are always the bad guy and native people are always the good guy, which is completely false. You have to remember that we have lived side by side for at least now for 500 years. And there are times when native people and Europeans are neck and neck brothers. We know, for instance, the native people love the French, they love the Germanic people, so they love the Dutch, they love the Germans, they love the Finns and the Swedes. They love them. And they love the Irish as well, and the Scots. Half the Scots they like, the other half they hate. And so the reason why, and I've done some research into this, and my own conclusions just from doing research is, one, so we're speaking of the Germanic people, so the Germans, the ethnic, continental Germans, but also their cousins, the Scandinavians, the Swedes, the Finns, who come into New Sweden colony. We're speaking a little bit far earlier, so I apologize for kind of leaving the time period a little bit. But the Germans are a heavy influence in New York, as we know, as well as in Pennsylvania. The native people love they love the Germanic peoples. Now, the Germanic peoples, you have to remember, are very Nordic. And so the Germanic peoples have a long history, even folk traditions of Thor, of Odin, of Freya, of all of their pagan mythology, pagan rites and rituals that the English kind of lost. And the French kind of lost, but they kept some of it. They kept some of their Celtic Gallic culture.
But the Germans really had held on to this stuff. I had a third great grandmother. Her name was Alvilda. And if you translate the name Alvilda, it literally translates to elf battle in German. And that's not a very Christian name. Elf battle is a very Nordic, Germanic, it's a very pagan name. But the Germans had a very long history of Hermanus, the German Herman who defeated the Romans in the forests of Teutoburg. You have all these folk traditions of witches and magic, and Odin and Freya and Thor. When the Germans come here, they see native people as what their ancestors were before the Romans. And they look at native people and they say, well, you are no different than what our ancestors were when, Tacitus came to Germany, to Germania, and wrote of our ancestors, which the English, enjoy telling us what barbarians we were, that we fought the Romans in the fort, that we were uncivilized, we were barbarians who threw spears at the Romans and wore the skins of animals and prayed to Yggdrasil in the forests of, you actually can read it with St. Boniface, that the ancient Germans, the Yggdrasil, which is the tree of life, the sacred ash tree, was in Hessen, where a lot of the Germans who came to New York from the Palatine region came from. The sacred tree was in Hessen, and Boniface cut it down, but it was the sacred ash tree that Odin hung himself on to give the world runes, and to give the language of runes to the Germanic people. And so the Germans look at native people and say, well, you are no different than what our ancestors were 1,000 years ago. And in time, you might become like us. The Germans also loved the Indians because they also hated the English to the utmost degree. And so the Germans were also physically, they were broad and they were strong and they were, 5'8", 5'10", 6 feet tall. They were strong, hardy people. And the native people loved that because they didn't like how the English were weak, that they cried and that they complained and that they would, they would get tired. The Germans, you could push, you could punch, you could beat them up, and they would keep moving. They would keep, move, and they would keep pushing forward. And the native people appreciated and admired that. When we speak of the Celts, the Scots, the Irish, and even the French, who have a Gallic culture, who have more of that Gallo-Roman culture, they too, we're speaking of the Celts and the Irish and the Scots, they come from clan cultures. So they just understood Indians very, very well, because it was just changing from Clan MacDonald to Bear Clan, from Clan O'Neill to, Turtle Clan. And they understood clan chiefs and clan culture because they came from a clan culture as well. And the French understood native people for the same reasons that they too had the very similar, that our ancestors once lived like you. But also the French were they believed strongly that they must convert the Indians and bring them to Christ. And that as long as the Indians became Catholics, they could do whatever they wanted. They could be as they wanted to be, but they just had to say they were Catholics and go to church on Sunday and accept the doctrines of Christianity. And so the biggest misconception is that Europeans are bad, native people are good, when we know for a fact that I exist because of the intermarriage of native people and Europeans. A lot of Native Americans who exist today exist because of the intermarriage of native people and Europeans. My two good friends, actually, who are Shinnecock, are Native American, African American, and Europeans. They have very African American features, blue eyes. Those blue eyes come from Europeans. And so we exist because of that admixture. And there are many times where native people and Europeans are the best of friends. Machikchimi, they are the best of friends. They are brothers. We know for a fact when the French come and burn German Flats, which is not very far from Albany, when they burn German Flats, the Oneidas come to the Germans and they warn the Germans, because they love the Germans. They call them our friends and our brothers. And they warn the Germans. They say, listen, the French are going to come here in 3 days' time and they're going to burn this place to the ground. Take your families and go. We don't want to see you get hurt. They didn't do that for the English. They did that for the Germans because they loved the Germans. And the Germans were good to them. And so, and a great quote I learned from a Wampanoag elder said, an Indian never forgets a wrong, but also never forgets a right. And so these people, the native people, remembered that the Germans were good to them. And they were strong people and good people. And same with the Swedes and the Finns, who populated parts of the Delaware River Valley in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. They loved the Indians, and the Dutch were so terrified, they actually made laws that the Swedes could not congregate with the Indians in their houses because they believed an insurrection was going to happen. So, I mean, I feel that's the biggest misconception,
because in the 18th and 17th century, there is no good guy, there is no bad guy. Everybody's out for their own motives, everybody's out for their own reasons, and there are good people and bad people on all fronts.
Thank you. I do have another question.
Right.
This is from Mark. Do you have a website or online presence concerning your vast knowledge of Native life?
What I have is a Facebook page right now. I am in the process of creating a digital page. I have not done that yet, but that is one that's been requested. And my girlfriend beats me over the head with that and saying, "Hey, you should have a website. Hey, you should have a website." And I'll say, "Yeah, I'll do it later." So it's on my list of things to do. But you can look up my name on Facebook and you can find me. And that's where you can, message me and do what you need.
I'm just going to put it in the chat if that's okay.
Yes. Yeah, that's great.
Great, brilliant. And we also have another compliment that I just wanted to let you know, saying that this was very, very informative. And it was really great to learn about, who and what different cultures are, especially in terms of, all of the change that's happening during this time period, and, the different also Native American cultures as well.
Yeah.
That was greatly appreciated. It's
really cool because I love the 17th and 18th century because you get this real admixture. You get this real hybrid culture. I really geek out when I think about like King Philip's War 1675, 76, seeing a Native American guy with a painted face and leggings and moccasins, but a broad English hat. Like to me that like I get all excited because that's this cool admixture of stuff that Native people are taking in European stuff. Seeing in a war party one European guy who's in there who's all painted up and and that was commonplace. And these things were normal, and it's stuff that we forget about in the time we live in now, that there is this mingling of culture, that there is this brotherhood and friendship that was so prevalent.
Any other questions?
Feel free to ask whatever you like. You cannot offend me. It is impossible to. And even if you try, I will just laugh and answer your question.
Let me just see. I'm not seeing any. Oh, good. I did get one. Okay, so how did they store food?
That's a great question. So a lot of the things about food that we know, so food's a very important part of culture. So I actually have with me a bowl. So this is a coal-burned bowl. So this is made the same way you would make a dugout canoe. You burn this out with fire. So it's made from one piece of wood. You take coals from a fire and you blow on the coals, and you heats up the wood. It burns it out, and you scrape, blow on the coals, heats it up, scrape till it gets down to where you need it to be. The spoon I have is made from a oyster shell, which I harvested from Long Island Sound. I actually ate this oyster. It was delicious. But food is a very important part of Algonkian culture and Iroquoian culture, all Native culture to be, Eastern Woodland culture to be exact. Food is one of the things that we give to share. It's a way to cement you into the community. If you were to enter a village to make a peace agreement or a treaty, first thing that would be offered you, besides a pipe, if you were a man, women were not offered the pipe. This was strictly between the men. Men and women did have both physical and spiritual roles that were important, and they were known, and no one was offended by them. But you would be offered food. You could have had a 10-course meal. I mean, you could be to the point where the buttons on your shirt were popping out, and you would be expected to eat. And if you did not eat, it would be seen as a great insult to that community, because you are saying to them, your food is not worthy of my body, that your food in your community is not good enough for me. Same thing with gift giving. If you were given a gift by a Native person, so a Native person at that village gave you, let's say they gave you a wampum bracelet, right? Like the one I have on my arm, right? You were expected to give something of equal or greater value. So you were expected to say, give up your neck knife. You were expected to give a bag of tobacco that you had. And if you did not, it was seen as a great insult. It was seen as not only you being greedy,
but also you lacking generosity. Generosity and reciprocity were very huge among Eastern woodland culture, and it still is. I'm what's called traditional, which means that I don't drink, I don't do drugs. I keep myself clean for spiritual activity, and I also follow a lot of those ancient traditions. And with my friends who are Shinnecock, who are my really good friends, if they give me something, I always gift them something back. It's part of our culture. It's what we do. So for an example, and I'll get to food in a quick second, since that was the question, but to speak on this reciprocity, because food's a part of that, you know, my good friend Dylan gifted me this neck knife sheath, and I gifted him a tobacco bag that I had made from the first deer I had ever tanned. And I had gifted him this, that had a real 18th century clay pipe in there. And I had gifted him that bag because I had to gift him something of equal or greater value. And his brother had gifted me something, and I gifted him copper sheet to give him something equal or greater value. So food's really important. So we know by this time, Native people are cooking in copper and brass kettles. So like this one, which is known as a dog ear kettle. It's called a dog ear kettle because if we look at the ears, they're folded like puppy ears. But we also know Native people are using these big brass kettles as well, like this one, for soups and for stews. Most Native food that's recorded, that we know of, that preserves to modern times, that survives in written accounts is soups, stews, and dry foods. In the summertime, things were eaten fresh, so fresh meats, fresh vegetables. But you remember, you have to keep food for an entire year. Your whole life is based off of the seasons. So it's not like today we're like, I'm hungry, I'm going to go to Big Y and go get a steak. Hungry. You have to think when you harvest food, all right, I need to harvest this much fish now, this much I can eat fresh right now, and this much I need to dry because I won't have food in the fall. Because right now the fish are spawning and there's a lot of them, and if I need to dry these out now so that I have food in the fall and the wintertime. So much of Native food was in preparation for the fall and for the winter. So we know a lot of the food that's recorded are soups, stews. There's really very little seasoning. A lot of the soups and stews are literally said that the Native people, they cut the meat off the animal, they put it in a pot of water, they boil it up, and they drink the broth and eat the meat. And that's it. No salt, no seasonings. But we do know Native people do trade for salt pork. They trade for peas from the English. So they do, and they trade for cheese, and they trade sometimes for rum. So we do know they like European foods. There in the 17th century, I remember I read there was a chief who went to council in Massachusetts, and they gave him a wheel of cheese. So imagine someone like me just hanging out with a wheel of cheese. This guy just had a wheel of cheese that they gave him as a gift to show their generosity, because they knew that the Indians understood gift giving, and that was a way to cement the agreement. So they just gave him a wheel of cheese. But so food, from what we understand, is mostly soups and stews, but dried food. So dried fish pemmican, meat pemmican, which is pounded and dried, mixed with dried berries. But dried fish, dried meats, dried berries. And then a lot of those dried meats would then be reconstituted in soups. Dried shellfish, too, were then reconstituted in soups. Also flint corn, so corn breads, corn cakes that are boiled. So I don't know if many of you have had food from South America. I work with Ecuadorians, and so much of their food is very similar to Eastern woodland food. So mote, which for them is what we would call hominy, which is in Ecuador, very commonplace. It's our PB&J for them, it's mote. And mote, they say, gives you a lot of strength and a lot of energy. That was a very common Eastern woodland food, was just flint corn, hominy corn that's boiled and then just eaten. But also boiled cornbreads, corn cakes as well. But we also know dried vegetables, and a lot of dried foods, fish, meats, soups and stews.
I don't see any other questions. So I just want to once again thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was an excellent conversation. I feel that I've learned a lot, and I see that that's being reflected in a lot of the comments. So thank you. We'll do a little silent virtual round of applause. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate
you
you
for having
taking
me.
time to educate us.
Oh, thank you.
All right. It was lovely to see everyone. And have a nice rest of your day. Enjoy the weather.
Yep, you too. Take care.
Thank you.